Appreciate everybody showing up tonight. This is the third of three scheduled events to correspond with the exhibit that we have tonight. In my opinion, this will probably be the best of the three that we've offered. Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Rebecca Turri. She is an associate professor of history and the co-director for the Center of the Gulf South and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Black Studies at the University of Southern Mississippi. She also serves on the boards of the Gulf Coast Gulf South Historical Association, the Mississippi Historical Society, and the Mississippi Encyclopedia. This past year, she served as a local arrangements and program chair for the annual Mississippi Historical Society Conference, which was held in Hattiesburg, and worked to strengthen ties between Southern Miss, the Historical Society, and the local community. She's the author of a book entitled Strategic Sisterhood, the National Council of Negro Women in the Black Freedom Struggle, which won the 2019 prize for Best Book in Southern Women's History from the Southern Association of Women Historians. Dr. Turri is also the winner of the 2021 Mississippi Humanities Council Teacher of the Year Award, the 2019 USM College of Arts and Sciences Junior Faculty of the Year, and a 2016 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend Award. That's a mouthful. That's a longer bio than what I've got, okay? So she's going to spend a few minutes going over material, some of it local to Prentiss County and Booneville. I know that she reached out to some of you who may find this topic of interest, of course. And then if you haven't visited the exhibit before arrival or in the past few weeks, I encourage you to do so after. I'll stick around until I know everybody's going through the exhibit that wants to, because we're down to just a few more, maybe 2 more weeks or so to the 16th before this moves on to Pascagoula down on the coast. So if you would, just welcome our instructor or our presenter, Dr. Rebecca Turri.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming to tonight's talk. Thank you especially to Dr. Will Bowling for your help in arranging this evening's event. Thank you also to Molly McMillan, Stuart Rockoff, and the entire team at the Mississippi Humanities Council for their support of the Museum on Main Street program, which Will was just talking to us about. Thank you also to Selwyn Ramp and the team at the Smithsonian for their support of Voices and Votes as it tours in Mississippi. So this Museum on Main Street exhibition seeks to bring smaller versions of exhibits from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History to all corners of America. And this exhibition, Voices and Votes, is touring our state for the next half a year. As Will said, it's going to go to Pascagoula next, and then on to Natchez, and then on to Vicksburg. It's already been in Hattiesburg and Utica. So my task as state scholar is to help contextualize the story of democracy in Mississippi. And I should say that my areas of expertise, as Will kind of pointed to, are really on African American history, civil rights history, and women's and gender history in America. So I do focus on those areas, but I try to kind of engage in different ways with all of the 6 sites for the Voices and Votes exhibition. And I do this in an effort to illuminate the history of political participation in our state from pre-European contact through to the present. So at times this can seem a little kind of expansive, scattered, but I wanted to touch on all of our 6 sites around the state. Mississippi, as you probably know, has been a central player in moving our United States of America towards a more perfect democracy. But this story has also been one of struggle. And I believe very deeply as a historian that we have to tell both the good and the bad, that's our responsibility as historians. And so voting, as I will show you tonight, begets power, or brings along power, but power also begets voting. And as I will show tonight, the 200-year-long fight for democracy in Mississippi has included many inspirational stories of democratic triumph, but that same fight has also been circumscribed by race, gender, class, age, and violence as citizens have fought and died for the right to vote, both at home but also abroad. So, and I do want to emphasize too, like, again, I only can speak as the scholar. I don't have that personal experience, and that's why I'm glad you're here tonight. So, and you know what? Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. It might slow me down a little bit, but it will make it a better presentation, okay? So I appreciate, again, everyone being here. So I am gonna talk a little bit, I'm gonna go way back in time here. And I'm gonna begin by just pointing out the groups of people who actually lived here before even Europeans arrived and sort of their political structure that existed. So although it's impossible to know sort of what existed before Europeans came, archaeologists can kind of piece together that before Hernando de Soto came in the mid-1500s, he encountered powerful Mississippian groups such as the Chickasaw right here in modern-day Boonville. And these Mississippian people were descendants of a powerful empire that had been centered at a place called Cahokia, which is in modern-day which is in the area that we now know as modern-day St. Louis. And it was at its height of power in the 1200s BCE. By the time of De Soto's arrival in North America in 1539, that great state of Cahokia was gone, but the great mound-building civilizations of the area remained. When the French returned about 200 years later, many of those mound builder nations were gone, but their descendants remained. And 45,000 Natchez people who were mound builders were in the area that would become the center of Mississippi's power later. On the eve of French settlement in the early 1700s, 20,000 Choctaw, 5,000 Chickasaw, and 5,000 Chickasaw were in Mississippi. There were other smaller groups, such as the Tunica and the Homa and the Yazoo and Biloxi, who remained in the state, but each nation had its own political structure. Most of these groups allowed the average person in the nation to have their say in society. And one thing that's really interesting about the Choctaw, and that was the largest group in Mississippi, was that every person had a bit of a say in their society. Leaders could only remain in power as long as their people supported them, and rarely had the power to coerce their people against their will into war. As was the case in Europe at the time, women were not the formal leaders of the Choctaw, but unlike Europeans, Choctaw people traced their ancestry through their mothers. Women were the food cultivators and the land managers and made all decisions for the community on food and anything having to do with land, which is where the food was grown. They also accompanied men on diplomatic missions, and compared to Europeans at the time, Choctaw women actually had more power in their society. While the Choctaw were the most populous Native American group in what would become Mississippi at the eve of European colonization, the Natchez Indians lived in the site that would become the heart of colonial and early Republican power for Europeans and later Americans. And again, I want to just say, if you want to get up and go check out the show, I will get to Boonville at the end of the presentation, so I don't want to bore you if you guys don't want to go through the long history of Mississippi with me. It's okay. But in 1716, French settlers built Fort Rosalie at Natchez on the bluff overlooking the mighty Mississippi River. On November 28th in 1729, in retaliation for the growing encroachment of these 200 French settlers on Natchez land, the Natchez killed 200 Frenchmen and took 300 more men, women, and children and enslaved people captive. In retaliation, the French drove most of the Natchez away from their homeland the following year. And those Natchez people who survived sought refuge with the tribes that had aligned themselves with the English. So it was like, different nations would align with either the English or the French on European arrival. And the English were on the winning side. And so the Natchez who remained went with the Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee. But the Natchez Indian Nation was mostly destroyed after this. After a few decades following the French loss in the French and Indian War in 1763, that French settlement at Natchez was transferred to the English and then to the Spanish. and then finally to U.S. control in 1798. The town of Natchez became the capital of Mississippi's territorial government, and Adams County was its first organized county. Natchez was quite the city. It boasted the first bank and the first school, called the Kerr School, in 1801. It housed the first Adams County, not Natchez, but its county, Adams, housed the first college, Jefferson College, which was founded in 1802, and the first institution for higher education for women, Elizabeth Female Academy, founded in 1818. And this is really significant. Elizabeth Female Academy was the 9th college for women in North America and the first in the Deep South. There were 2 in North Carolina by that time. But so, Mississippi was educating its young women much earlier than other places around the country. Natchez was also this ethnic melting pot, both before and after the Civil War, with the state's largest immigrant population in the postbellum period. Also, it was religiously diverse, with Jewish services being held in Natchez around 1800, and many different types of Christianity were also represented in that town. Now, Mississippi achieved statehood after American settlers won the Creek War in 1814. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, none other than General Andrew Jackson proved victorious in the battle that killed nearly 50 Tennessee militiamen and 900 Creek. The remaining Creek were driven from the area, and that victory at Horseshoe Bend cleared the way for the creation of both Mississippi in 1817 and Alabama, which was carved from the Mississippi Territory, in 1819. So Natchez was the state's original capital, and the state constitution was drafted at nearby Jefferson College. And although there was no popular referendum, which would mean that everybody was invited to participate in the creation of this constitution for the state, the leaders in the state still created a very progressive constitution for the time period. All white men, even those who did not own property, could vote. And this is really significant and shows sort of the forward thinking of Mississippi at the time. Men did have to be 21 years old. They had to spend at least a year and a half living in the county that they were voting in, and they had to either serve in a militia or pay a tax. And those voting citizens were then able to choose their U.S. representatives, and apportionment for the number of representatives to the state legislature was based on the number of white male property owners in those voting districts. However, there were some less than progressive things, as you can imagine, from the 1818s. So in order to run for office, a candidate had to be a substantial landowner. To hold office for 3 years in the Senate, he had to be a property owner of 300 acres. To serve 1 year in the House of Representatives, he had to own 150 acres. One notable element of the Constitution was that enslaved people could be freed if the owners consented, or if the enslaved people themselves could prove distinguished service to the state of Mississippi. Now, this last point that I mentioned about the Mississippi Constitution is very important because it does hint at the limit of democracy and the extent of slavery in Mississippi at the time of the state's founding. Americans flooded into Mississippi after statehood and brought enslaved people with them. The Euro-American population in Mississippi jumped from 10,000 in 1798 to 200,000 by 1817. With that drastic increase in population, the population of enslaved people also jumped from 4,000 in 1798 to 70,000 in 1817. While Natchez was a center of commerce in the early Republican period, its wealth derived from cotton plantations. From 1792 to 1840, Natchez was the town with the highest population of enslaved people in Mississippi, with them being anywhere from between 42 to 52% of the population. And Natchez's forks in the road site, ironically at roads originally named Liberty and Washington Road, became the second largest slave trading site in the antebellum period after New Orleans. So Natchez also made its money through slave trading as well. The National Park Service right now is actually redesigning its forks in the road site for anybody who is visiting Natchez and interested in that. And yet, in spite of the difficult situation, the difficulties of things like family separation and slavery, Natchez also boasted the state's largest free black population with over 200 people in the antebellum period. After the end of the Civil War and the advent of emancipation, black political power grew tremendously in Natchez. Reconstruction was a time that black leaders, many of them newly freed, pushed for all men not only to be free, but to have the right to vote. So while the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December of 1865, finally freed all formerly enslaved people, the 14th Amendment guaranteed due process and citizenship to all people born on U.S. soil, and the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1817, guaranteed the right to vote to all black men. Natchez, again, that great original city of Mississippi, was the home to many powerful black leaders during Reconstruction, including John Roy Lynch. Any of you been to Jackson and driven on Lynch Street? It is named for this man. He served as Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives and then was a member of our United States Congress from 1873 to 1877, and then again from 1881 to 1883. He was one of the first black congressmen in our nation. And Hiram Revels, the first black senator in the United States of America who moved to Natchez after the war. And Mississippi had the only 2 black senators up until 1965. Ordinary black Union veterans and other citizens also displayed political sentiments as they celebrated the Union victory and honored martyred soldiers after the Civil War. Black citizens of Natchez at this time began the 30th of May celebration, the over 130-year-old tradition of a Memorial Day walking parade from Vidalia, Louisiana, across the river to Natchez to honor Union veterans. Another important site of black political power after the Civil War was Vicksburg. Like Natchez, Vicksburg brought in a lot of different people, lots of immigrants. It was a manufacturing town and home to the largest population of immigrants in the antebellum period, even bigger than Natchez. Vicksburg is perhaps best known as the site of the pivotal turning point in the Civil War, when Union forces besieged the city for 47 days, starting on May 18th, 1863, and of course, ending delivering complete control of the Mississippi River to the Union on July 4th, 1863. But it was also a site of major changes to political power during Reconstruction. Vicksburg was home to one of the largest camps of newly freed people after the siege of Vicksburg. Hiram Revels, that first black senator in the United States, actually moved from Baltimore, where he had been a minister, to Vicksburg to help organize schools and churches there for newly freed people. He also helped organize 2 regiments for the Union Army and served as a chaplain to a regiment. He moved to Natchez after the war. So hopefully you can see how much veterans are a part of our story here. Upon Mississippi's readmission to the Union in 1869, many prominent black leaders either were from or had ties to Vicksburg. Thomas W. Stringer served in the Mississippi Constitutional Convention in 1868. This is where they voted to come back into the United States, and then served in the Mississippi Senate in 1870. Thomas Cardozo was the first black state superintendent of education in 1874, and I.D. Shadd served in the Mississippi State Legislature and as Speaker of the House of Representatives of Mississippi from 1874 to 1876. Perhaps more than any other site, Vicksburg shows tremendous political activity of black Mississippians during federal Reconstruction. But Vicksburg also serves as a cautionary tale to show that such impressive and real political power and gains could also be taken away in only a few short years. For Vicksburg was the site of a major massacre in 1874 that stripped black locals and Republicans of political power. Paramilitary groups that were the violent arm of the all-white Democratic Party at the time sought to remove black elected leaders from office with violence in 1874, in the elections of 1874. And it succeeded. After Democrats took political control that November, white Democrats in the area tried to remove Warren County Sheriff Peter Crosby, who was black, and other Republican or black officials through indictment in fall of 1874. When that didn't work, white locals took control of the county courthouse to try to remove Crosby in early December. And then Crosby's supporters, most of whom were black, marched to the city to bring him back to office. And then fighting broke out. 2 white locals and at least 29 black locals were killed in the ensuing fighting. And this event set off what what historians now call the Mississippi Plan, or the plan to use violence to intimidate voters, candidates, and elected officials of the Republican Party. And white Democrats' philosophy in the mid-1870s and beyond was that might would make right, that you could use violence to stop people from voting. And with violence at the polls and in the community, white Democrats had the majority of the state's congressional power again in 1875, and they took control of the judiciary, the courts, in 1876. And these 3 years in Mississippi paved the way to restrict voting throughout the Deep South and other states. And other states watched as the federal government did nothing in response to the violence at the polls. And so this is when we begin to see the beginning of Jim Crow. This is how it started in 1874. So after the violence, oh man, I'm sorry, I'm behind here. After the violence of the Mississippi Plan, remember that took place in the 1870s. About 15 years later, we had a new constitution that came about. White Democratic politicians stripped black citizens of political power with seemingly neutral laws in this new state constitution of 1890 that enshrined voting restrictions such as a poll tax. Certainly y'all have heard of that. The poll tax, and the other thing that they used was the understanding clause. And I have images of the Constitution here, and you can see those clauses. These, again, like I said, they say nothing about race in them. They seem to be race neutral, but when white Mississippians went to the courthouse, they would get help with filling out this understanding clause, or they would be given money for the poll tax. So these seemingly neutral laws did have a disproportionate effect on black voters in the state and on poor white voters as well, but more on poor black voters. Mississippi's new state constitution provided that main model for other Deep South states to create new constitutions to restrict voting rights over the next 15 years. And this is, why we get Jim Crow. This is how we get the Jim Crow period in Mississippi and in the Deep South. In spite of those increased restrictions and violence during Jim Crow, black communities established institutions like churches, organizations, and schools that sustained them in this difficult time where they did not have the vote. There is perhaps no better site to discuss such a perseverance than Utica, which was our last site for this exhibition. In Utica, local churches were crucial to black Mississippians' survival during Jim Crow. And you probably feel the same way about your own church. It is a very important site for healing and support. Churches were community gathering sites as well as spiritual and economic support sites for community members. Notable black churches in Utica were St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church and White Oak Baptist Church. And around the state, many black colleges and schools were founded at this same time as well. Rust College was founded in 1866, Alcorn in 1871, and Jackson State in 1877. And other colleges promoted industrial training to provide jobs during the Jim Crow era. And one of those institutions is fairly close to here. It is Okolona College, which was open from 1902 to 1965. But in 1903 in Utica, William Holtzclaw established the Utica Normal and Industrial School, which helped support the local black community through education and support. Now, Holtzclaw was born in Alabama. He's not from Mississippi, but he was the part of a very proud first generation of people who were born free. And at the age of 20, he attended Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute and worked for Washington as his buggy driver and went to school slowly for over the course of 7 years. Worked hard, went to school. He moved to Utica and was hired as a teacher at St. Peter's School. And in Utica, he recognized that there were black residents who were landowners, and they seemed to care about farming, but there was no educational institution for them. So he founded the Utica Institute in 1903, first as a school of about 20 students, including 2 boarding students. The motto of the school was based on the Hampton Institute mission to train hand, head, and heart, so that students would learn a trade, gain that education, and build their faith. So faith was always a part of these institutions. And he helped build up the Institute's power by founding the Negro Farmers Conference in 1905 and the Black Belt Society around the same time to support education and help upgrade black Southerners' economic standing in the state, especially when they did not have the right to vote. In 1915, he published his autobiography, Black Man's Burden, which was modeled after his mentor Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery. This was one of the first books published by a black Mississippian, and you can get it today. I encourage you all to go to Utica and check it out. In just 6 short years, the Utica Institute grew to over 25 faculty and 500 students. Around this same time, Holtzclaw purchased 2,000 acres for a new site for the school on the land that Utica Hines Community College Utica sits on. Holtzclaw had raised $25,000 from friends and colleagues for the land. Students at the school learned about farming, brick masonry, furniture making, printing, and laundering. In 1916, the school began training an officers' corps. One of the most well-known groups associated with the Utica Institute was the Utica Jubilee Singers. The group was founded in 1925, and they toured the country trying to fundraise for the school. The school also had a nursing program and a training hospital, the only in the area for black people, until 1935 when it was destroyed by a tornado. While institutions such as the Utica Institute enriched and supported black communities and people during Jim Crow, black citizens in Mississippi remained unable to vote en masse until the modern civil rights movement. And so World War II, here we go again, World War II was an important turning point in finally chipping away at Jim Crow in Mississippi to grant voting rights to African Americans in the state. So during World War II, the federal government indicated that it would support black Americans in a way that it hadn't done before. So you have the federal government becoming involved in trying to ensure that all people can vote in a way that hadn't happened before. But they also wanted to ensure that all people could work during World War II as well. In June of 1941, even before the United States had officially entered the war, but was making weapons for the Allies, FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which created the Federal Employment Practices Commission to investigate instances of racial discrimination in hiring and pay within the military defense industry. So any company that the government was contracting with was supposed to be desegregated. And black activists saw this and thought that maybe if the federal government got involved in this area, that maybe the federal government would step in to help ensure that black people could vote in the South later. Okay. The federal government did not desegregate the defense industry out of its own forward thinking, though. It did get pushed to this point by this man, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest black union at the time. In the spring of 1941, he threatened to lead a march of 100,000 people to Washington. And this was actually the first March on Washington in 1941, 22 years before Martin Luther King had a dream in Washington, D.C. This guy was threatening to bring a bunch of people to Washington, D.C. And he actually originally wanted FDR to desegregate the Army too, but FDR did not do that. He only desegregated the military, the industrial services. But he did agree to it. And so this was showing that the federal government was going to become involved. Randolph called off the march, and the federal government vowed to help root out racial discrimination in those federally contracted jobs. During World War II, Mississippi experienced an industrial boom as 750 new industrial plants were set up, and the state's per capita income tripled between 1940 and 1946. Unfortunately, Mississippi, with its rigid segregation, resisted the efforts of the federal government to try to desegregate its industry, but not everywhere. In some areas, including in Meridian, there were efforts to try to desegregate training. But in this place, in Pascagoula, at Ingalls Shipyard, there wasn't much progress made on the racial front. In 1938, Robert Ingalls founded the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation in Pascagoula. He was attracted to Mississippi because it had just created the Balanced Agriculture with Industry program to try to attract industry to the state. Though the shipyard was founded before the war, production skyrocketed during World War II. Ingalls Shipyard was best known for its speedy process of creating a steel ship from all welded material. Ingalls sent off the first of this kind of ship, the Exchequer, into the Pascagoula River in 1940. And later, this ship was purchased by the U.S. Navy and sent into service in the Pacific Theater. As historian Chuck Bolton has pointed out, between 1939 and 1947, Ingalls on the Mississippi Gulf Coast built more than 40% of all of the large C-3 cargo ships for the Maritime Commission and the U.S. Navy. Ingalls Shipyard provided many people with jobs, and that helped pull them out of the Depression. By June 1942, the shipyard employed 5,000 workers. That number doubled in 6 months and stayed strong at 11,000 total workers through the duration of the war. Most of the new workers were white men and women from the rural countryside. One such migrant was Elvis Presley's father, Vernon Presley, who moved his family to Pascagoula for 5 weeks in 1943. However, in the shadow of industrial success, there were still setbacks. Bolton has emphasized that Ingalls kept wages for workers lower than other industrial employers in the area, and in order to keep work up, Ingalls extended work shifts and brought in migrant agricultural workers during their agricultural off-seasons. Ingalls also initially resisted women workers, but eventually turned to hiring women. The National Defense Training School in Pascagoula began accepting women for welding courses in September 1942. Ingalls hired its first 5 women welders in mid-September, and by 1945, 5% of welders at Ingalls were women, and women comprised 10% of all the shipyard's employees. Black workers also comprised 10% of the workers at Ingalls as well, but unfortunately, only 92% of them were in unskilled jobs. By the end of 1942, only 10 black women were hired at Ingalls out of 9,000 employees, and all of them were maids. Despite these limitations, though, World War II was still a moment of dramatic change for soldiers, workers, and communities in Mississippi. Though not perfect in its enforcement, the FEPC was still an important symbol to black Mississippians that the federal government was going to become involved in promoting equality for them in our state. In addition, the war mobilization pushed by the federal government brought high-paying jobs to many people in the state, including in my hometown of Hattiesburg. Sorry. There we go. Black Americans flocked to these new higher-paying war jobs. Really, everybody flocked to these new higher-paying war jobs and spent their money in whatever community they were working in. In Hattiesburg, workers helped prepare Camp Shelby for the arrival of soldiers and then kept the camp running once they were here. World War II also enriched local businesses as soldiers were stationed at Camp Shelby and spent their wages in the businesses in and around the black thoroughfare of Mobile Street. These businesses fostered the civil rights movement a decade later because they served an all-black clientele. And that made them less vulnerable to threats to their livelihood. So their job couldn't be taken by the state when they began to fight for increased political power for black people. So I'm trying to show the repercussions here of World War II, especially for the civil rights movement. Nationally, black Americans also became more involved in activism during World War II as well. Thousands joined unions. NAACP membership grew tenfold, and these efforts were part of the Double V campaign, officially named by the national black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, in 1942. The campaign called for black Americans to fight fascism abroad against Hitler and at home against Jim Crow. So, Double V campaign. World War II also helped embolden returning black veterans here in Mississippi. In 1944, the Supreme Court passed Smith versus Allwright. It doesn't seem that important, okay? It just outlawed the all-white Democratic primary. But in a state like Mississippi at the time, the Democratic Party was the only party that mattered. And so that all-white primary really did prevent any participation from black candidates. So in the election of 1946, which was the first election after the war and after Smith versus Allwright, 5,000 black Mississippians tried to register to vote, and most of them were veterans. Half of those people who tried were successful. One of the unsuccessful ones was Medgar Evers, who along with his friends tried to register to vote unsuccessfully at the courthouse in Decatur, Mississippi. Evers, of course, would go on to serve as the first Mississippi State Field Secretary for the NAACP from 1954 until his assassination in 1963. World War II helped to fuel new activist fires in Hattiesburg too, and the local NAACP chapter, that of Forest County, was founded by veterans on September 9, 1946. In 1950, 15 black plaintiffs from Hattiesburg also did something new. They filed suit in a federal court against a local registrar. Now, that local registrar would ask crazy questions like how many bubbles are in a bar of soap for the understanding clause. And so black applicants would be failed on their answers. But these 15 plaintiffs wanted that to stop. And so Luther Cox had allowed several thousand whites to register to vote in the 15 years that he'd been in office, but he'd only allowed 50 black people to vote. And so the P versus Cox plaintiffs argued that under the 15th Amendment, which remember grants all men the right to vote, they should be guaranteed the right to register and thus to vote, but not be required to interpret the Constitution since white people weren't having to do the same thing. Okay, so they're trying to equalize that out. They did not ask for damages, only the rights for all citizens, black and white, to vote. And it is important to note that the P versus Cox applicants filed in federal court. They had been emboldened to try to file suit in the federal courts because of the federal government's support for black workers during World War II. Now, U.S. District Judge Sidney Mize initially dismissed the challenge, saying that the plaintiffs needed to go through the proper protocol and go through the states first. But the plaintiffs knew if they went through the state of Mississippi, they would get nowhere. So they appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court, again, a federal court. And there, the U.S. Circuit judges found in their favor. They reversed the district court ruling by ordering that applicants should only either read or interpret the Constitution, and only if they could not read would they do that. But they should not have to do both. And the court also ruled that there would be an evidentiary hearing before the Board of Election Commissioners every October to try to ensure that black citizens in Hattiesburg were able to vote. But that ruling did nothing. By May 30th, 1955, 4 years after the U.S. District Court ruling, the FBI reported that 2,195 whites and only 5 blacks have been registered to vote in Forest County since January 1st, 1954. And so it was that kind of resistance that led to support for a Civil Rights Act. Congress pushed for the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and testimony from Hattiesburger W.D. Ridgway even became part of the evidence package used to pass the act. Now, that Civil Rights Act probably doesn't mean anything to you. You probably never even heard about it. But it was the first Civil Rights Act to be passed since 1875. And it created the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which empowered federal prosecutors to begin to go after registrars who were not following the law, who were not allowing everybody to vote. It also established a Civil Rights Commission to investigate discrimination and recommended ways to fix such discrimination. And it established the precedent that the federal government was going to get involved in the state's business along the line about voting. And so that's what was necessary for people in the civil rights movement. It took the federal government's oversight there. Another important Civil Rights Act came 3 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, which allowed the federal government to examine local voter registration rules and introduce criminal penalties to registrars who obstructed people who were trying to vote. And this later mattered in Hattiesburg when the registrar of Forest County, the next one after Luther Cox, Theron Lind, actually was sued by the U.S. Justice Department. And he was convicted of voter discrimination under this new 1960 Act. And as part of his conviction, he was supposed to register the black applicants who were clearly fit to vote. I mean, these people had advanced degrees and everything and were denied the right. But over 3 years, Lynn continued to refuse to comply. And so Lynn's stubbornness in the courts to actually abide by his conviction and follow the rule of law is what pushed Hattiesburg civil rights activists to turn to protest in the streets, to turn to what we as historians call direct action protests, marches, boycotts. Why do people do that? They do that because the court's not doing what it should, right? And so that's what happened in 1964 in Hattiesburg. The local activists hosted a mass day of protest called Freedom Day. And it was the first of 3 Freedom Days sponsored by civil rights groups around the state. The goal of Freedom Day was to overwhelm the Forest County Courthouse with black registrants and national civil rights leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer. Hopefully y'all have heard, I'm sure you heard of her. John Lewis and Ella Baker, these are big civil rights activists at the time, came down for the event. The morning of the day was dreary, it was raining, it was yucky, but 200 marchers showed up to the Forest County Courthouse by 10:30, and they continued to march around our courthouse all day until 5 p.m. when 75 remained, and only a handful of people were allowed to take the test. But people kept coming after that first march and kept trying to register to vote. And in the process, as they were denied the right to vote, different activists began to create a paper trail that was later used in justifying the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that became very important in opening up the vote for all people in this nation. While the televised Bloody Sunday March in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965 is what most people think of when they think of why President Lyndon B. Johnson finally called for a Voting Rights Act in 1965. Mississippi activists, such as the ones who marched on Freedom Day, such as those in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was founded in 1964, those different activists built up evidence. This group, the MFDP, collected over 15,000 pages of depositions describing voter discrimination in our state. And it's that testimony that helped push Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. And while, I know that not everybody might love the MFDP or the history of that, it's something I very deeply believe we should all be proud of as Mississippians. This state helped to push the nation to ensure that all people could vote. That is huge. And so that Voting Rights Act really mattered. It meant that the federal government could monitor states to make sure that no one was being denied the right to vote. And the act was incredibly successful in boosting the number of black voters in America. Eligible black Americans who were registered to vote jumped nationally from 12% in 1947 to 43% on the eve of the passage in 1964 to 63% in 1976. So there was an increase. But in Mississippi, the Voting Rights Act mattered even more.
In 1964, only 6.7% of all black Mississippians who were qualified were on the voter registration rolls. 5 years later, the percentage had jumped to 66.8%. That's huge. And Mississippi should be honored for its role in changing the law. So, this talk so far, again, I told you before, I study African American history, I study women's and gender and civil rights history, so I know I focused on that. But we're finally at Boonville. And this talk has considered the work of Mississippians to push for democracy from within our state. And several civil rights activists in Mississippi, such as Medgar Evers, who I mentioned earlier, tried to vote in 1946, and Vernon Dahmer, who is from Hattiesburg, who was murdered by the Klan in 1966. Those two men are a handful, two of a handful of people who fought to ensure that black Mississippians had the right to vote. But other Mississippians sacrificed their lives for the fight for democracy abroad in military service to our country. And as we saw earlier in the story of returning World War II servicemen, veterans have helped to push our nation towards a more perfect democracy. But they have also tried to ensure democracy abroad as well. Mississippi soldiers who fought in the Vietnam War were fighting to support the democratic, US-backed South Vietnamese government. And I end my talk tonight by acknowledging the ultimate sacrifice of the 3 Vietnam veterans from Boonville who were killed in the war. And please feel free to stop me if you want to, or whatever you want. I appreciate all of you being here so deeply. The Vietnam War heated up in 1965 as Lyndon Johnson sent ground troops to the opposite corner of the globe. More than 10% of Mississippi's population, more than 10% of people in our state, an estimated 227,000 people served in the Vietnam War. That's huge. 669 citizens were killed in the war, with a few still listed as missing in action today. And I might have the number wrong, so please correct me if you know different. 3 men from Boonville and 9 from Prentiss County died during their service in the Vietnam War. And these men were all young. Sergeant Kenneth Braxton Carpenter was born on June 23, 1944. He married his high school sweetheart, Brenda. While they were young and in love, they experienced tragedy with 2 infant children dying before he left to serve in the war. Brenda endured the unthinkable again when her husband died on January 2nd, 1968, at the age of 23. While Kenneth gave his life, Brenda also suffered as a young widow. She married another Vietnam veteran, J.W. Jacobs, who is here in the audience with us tonight. Thank you. But she continued to honor Kenneth's memory and sacrifice. And in July 2011, she traveled 200 miles from Boonville to Jackson to bring a picture of Sergeant Carpenter to Jackson to ensure that his portrait is included in the National Education Center at the National Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. Larry Floyd Dodds, and was he a sergeant or a private? I'm sorry that I don't have that listed. Specialist. Specialist Larry Floyd Dodds was born on October 28, 1948, and died when he was only 20 years old on May 20th, 1969. And we have his family members here with us tonight. Thank you for being here. After his death, his parents, Floyd, who himself was a World War II veteran and a Purple Heart recipient who served under General Patton in the 3rd Army in Normandy, Western and Central Europe. And Dodds' mother, Imogene, had to pick up the pieces and continue living without their son. So did Larry's 8 brothers and 2 sisters. Floyd and Imogene went on to live their long lives after Larry's death. Before their deaths, which were within a month of one another in 2014. They had just celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary. In addition to having 11 children, they had 55 grandchildren and 26 great-grandchildren. While they lived full lives, there is no doubt that the shock and sadness of losing their son, but also the pride in his sacrifice, stayed with them always. Finally, we have, and I'm sorry, I don't know if he's a private sergeant, but we'll find out. William Franklin Stringer was born on September 8th, 1944, and died at the age of 24 on June 25th, 1969. Like Larry Floyd Dodds, he was not married. His parents, Lois and Eugene Stringer, also had to endure without their son. William's 3 brothers also continued on without him. Is there anyone from his family here today? Or friends? As young men like Larry Floyd Dodds died at age 20, 1 year before he could vote, and Kenneth Carpenter and William Stringer had only had one chance to vote before their deaths, Americans called for pushing back the age for voting from 21 to 18. And this was the reason, the foundation behind why we have our 26th Amendment and why 18-year-olds, including those at Northeast Mississippi Community College, can vote. It is in recognition of the ultimate sacrifice of young people like these heroes in Vietnam and their loved ones who continued in the aftermath, because Brenda was not even 21 either at that time. This granted the 18-year-olds the right to vote and was ratified in 1971. So this is another important step in the story of democracy in our nation. Young people who give their lives should have the right to vote. I understand that this year Boonville celebrated its 5th annual celebration to honor the sacrifice of Vietnam veterans with a helicopter flyover. I'm glad that Boonville honors its heroes in this way. Other communities around our state, I want you to know, we're also working to memorialize our veterans. At USM, we have a brand new Veterans Center. I hope that if you're in Hattiesburg, you'll check it out. It's beautiful. Today, you can see most of the faces of the 669 Mississippians killed in the war in the Vietnam Veteran Memorial in Ocean Springs. Many of you may wonder how the memorial for the entire state ended up on the coast, which is about 350 miles due south from here. And it's a story that I think you probably know, but in case you don't, I'll try to tell it here. In 1988, the replica of the National Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., the Moving Wall, came to Biloxi, Mississippi. And refugees from South Vietnam who had settled as fishermen on the Mississippi Gulf Coast after the end of the Vietnam War, and their families wanted to honor the sacrifice of Americans who had tried to fight to protect democracy for them in South Vietnam. They then were the beginning point of the creation of this memorial, and they created a committee and plans to honor the Vietnam veterans on the Gulf Coast. So out of tragedy came collaboration and a continued reverence for democracy. Maybe not the story most people hear about the Vietnam War, but certainly one that matters tremendously to people who live on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. This is also one we hold dearly in our state today. So although my talk today has been a very broad sweep of political changes in Mississippi, I hope it highlights how powerful yet fragile democracy for all people can be, and like the tremendous, tremendous cost of protecting it. Many things have changed in our state and country over the last decade. Unfortunately, it feels like many Americans seem to be losing their faith in democracy. But I encourage you to push back against this and remind your neighbors, your family members, your husband, of the great value of our nation's political system that, while not perfect, still holds great potential for all people in our state. Let us honor the sacrifice of veterans and civil rights activists who both sets fought and died to uphold our political system. We must also ensure that voting laws and restrictions are not preventing citizens from exercising their right to vote. Mississippi has been filled with stories of courageous people who have pushed for full citizenship at the battlefield and the courthouse. We must remember the final words of Hattiesburg civil rights leader and martyr Vernon Dahmer, again murdered in 1966 for his voting work. And his mantra was, if you don't vote, you don't count. If we are to make this a more perfect union, we must continue to fight for the democracy that he and others have died defending. Thank you very much.
We've got a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Turri?
Or comments? I would love comments. I'm not we have two Vietnam historians at USM. Dr. Andy Wiest, you might know him, and Dr. Heather Sturr. So I'm a little out of my element, but I would love to hear more. And I appreciate you being here. Yes, ma'am. I know a little bit, but I'd love to know more. What do you know about Camp Shelby?
I would invite you first of all to go to the museum.
The Armed Forces Museum?
In there, and they can check out some historical sites where the prisoner of war camps were. They still have a swastika carved into the ground and an arrow carved pointing to their barracks because they thought they were going to win the war. They would see them as they flew over. And just to these things, like we actually perform wedding ceremonies overseas to the United States prisoners of war is here. So it's just the fact that they need to see how kind and faithful we are as veterans to deliver the victory.
Thank you for that. Did everybody hear that? The Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, at Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, if you are in the area, go see it. And it's a wonderful point that you bring up that, soldiers from the United States adhere to human rights rules, to the Geneva Convention, that they are serving with honor. And so that is something that, is a good reminder. And I appreciate you telling me that.
You got any kind of a modern, present context on aftermath of Shelby versus Holder and how that Shelby
Yeah,
versus
so
Holder-
I didn't, that in another, if I didn't want to keep going, but yes, so Shelby versus Holder was a Supreme Court decision in 2013 that basically took away the formula to decide which areas need to be monitored by the federal government. It did not completely get rid of the rule that the federal government should monitor, but without any kind of way of telling who should be monitored, there's no more monitoring. And in the aftermath of that, there have been new rules to voting legislation that have had an effect of reducing the number of people who can vote. So they removed the preclearance. If Congress will vote on a new formula, it will be reinstated. But I don't think that's going to happen. So right now, so that is why, yes, so since 2013, that's why you've seen a lot of changes to voting laws, because now the states can do that again without getting the approval from the federal government. And if we look to civil rights history, the federal government has been helpful in protecting black Mississippians' rights, right? And so without that federal preclearance, what it means is that it's going to take someone saying, I was discriminated against, and bringing it to court in a lengthy court battle, which of course is much harder to do than like a formula that just like nips it in the bud before it happens. That's where we're at right now. So yeah, that is why we have different voting laws changing, right now. And I would just encourage you to think about history and think about, let's make sure that everybody who is trying to vote can actually vote, right? Yes.
I'll say one thing.
Would you like?
This place was crammed full with that mess. I don't like this thing.
You don't like? Okay. What? Do you want to, yeah, okay. I'm not much help.
Anyway, I wish this place was crammed full. That was one of the greatest. And when I asked about it, people that knows me, I got real bad hearing problem. I got loaded up with this and all, but 82% of hearing loss. And I don't hardly ever understand the woman talking.
I appreciate you're here anyway.
You just done so good putting it out there, and I thank you so much for coming up here. I just wish this place was full.
Okay, well,
I guess we have more advertising and something to it,
Yeah.
you know.
well,
But thank you very much.
yeah, well, thank you for your service, and thank you to your wife too, who also served, you know. I think that's one thing, my colleague Andy Wiest has written a book about the widows and the mothers and the daughters who remain behind. And I think it's called The War at Home or something. I'm sorry. If you look up his name, Wiest, have any of y'all seen this documentary, The Boys of 67? His book is the basis for that documentary. So it might be something to check out too. Other questions or comments? I mean, I appreciate everybody being here in person. You know, it takes a lot to get up and come, hear something that is not always fun to listen to, you know, and but I appreciate everybody being here, and I just hope that you know, I can be of service to you guys to help publicize the story of your loved ones or whatever you guys want to tell. You know, I'm going to 3 other places in Mississippi with essentially this same talk. So you guys can tell me what you want said about Boonville, and I'll put it in here. So, well, sorry, I thought you were going to ask a question. No. Okay, well, thank you.
Oh yeah. So we appreciate your time, Dr. Turri. I knew it was going to be good when we knew you were coming. So I know we've got 2 history instructors here listening to your talk tonight, myself and Mr. Smith. And so I'm sure Eric is the same. Mr. Smith's probably the same way. When we hear these talks or read new material, we're trying to connect the dots, stuff that we teach in the classroom, and connect it to what we're hearing. And so I don't know that I'd ever read anything or heard anything about the double V. I'm going to look up and read more on that later. Of course, you know, a lot of us, if not all of us, have heard about Ingalls Shipyard, and I've read about it, obviously, to teach U.S. history too. I've read about Ingalls and the racial component there, the gender component, and how even today it's still an economic driver for the coast and for that area. And then there was another thing that I had not known or was not familiar with, the connection between Utica and Booker T. Washington. We teach Booker T. Washington, but I was not aware of that. Now I can teach Utica and not what was going on in Alabama so much. So maybe talk about Booker's influence on what came to be in Utica. So if you haven't seen the exhibit, we'll be around for a few more minutes. I will not leave until I know everybody that wants to see the exhibit has seen the exhibit. We will start to do the de-install, start to take it apart a few days actually before August the 16th. We'll probably, I think that's the 14th, 13th, we'll start to take it apart so that we can get it loaded up in time to go down on the coast to Pascagoula, where it spends the next 6 weeks down there before going on to the next stops. So if you want to stick around, if you haven't seen it, depending on what door you came in from, the exhibit hall in this building is straight across from the main entrance. So you can't get lost in Anderson. It's just a square. You just follow it around and you'll see the exhibit room. So we appreciate your time. Let other people know between now and let's just say August 12th and 13th. If anybody wants to come take a look, there's a lot of good display items there. Feel free to come while the college is open during normal college hours. So again, thank you for your time. Thanks.